Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to NCHV's quarterly webinar serving LGBTQ veterans. My name is David Higgins. I'm the communications specialist at NCHV. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us. This is the third webinar in our webinar series this year, which focuses on equity in veteran housing. Our first two webinars, the first one focused on veterans with lived experience, and our second webinar focused on veterans, on Native veterans. One second. Yes, focus on Native veterans. We have two great panelists today for us that will share their knowledge and expertise on the subject. If you guys have any questions for our panelists, please use the question function on the on your GoToWebinar app or wherever you logged in at to send questions to us, and we can have we'll answer the questions at the end of the webinar. So with that being said, I will kick it to Jean-Michel to do his introduction. I think Brian is having a bit of audio difficulties, and we'll get back to Brian after we get it sorted out.
Jean-Michel, I think you can go ahead and start. I think David's going to try and fix Brian's issues on the back end. So.
Good afternoon, everybody. Sorry, we were having a little bit of a technical problem getting me unmuted, but here we are and everything is fine. I'm Jean-Michel Giraud, the President and CEO of Friendship Place in Washington, D.C., and we're a homeless services organization serving the D.C. metropolitan area, and with a national impact through best practices. We travel to present at conferences during the year and participate in webinars like this one. We are also an SSVF service provider in the DC metropolitan area, and really delighted to be partnering with the SSVF team on the work to house veterans again, and that we started in 2011. I want to thank the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans for this invite, and looking forward to talking to you at the Q&A.
So Jean-Michel, Brian is still having issues, so I guess we'll go ahead with your presentation first. Give me a second so I can get to your slides.
All right, very good. So this afternoon, we're going to talk about housing challenging for veterans who are members of the LGBTQ+ community. We're going to look at the history of the community, because I think it's important to realize where the community has been, where it's come from, where it is now, what the challenges are now, of course. And for disclosure, I am a member of the LGBTQ community. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. These are our values. We can go to the next slide. You can look at that later when you get the PowerPoint. Great. So a lot of progress has been made by the LGBTQ community in this country, and by the way, in other countries where there were forms of oppression against the community historically. But unfortunately, some discrimination and bias remain. And it's important to say that because some people feel that when marriage for all was adopted, it was sort of the end of that process. But unfortunately, uh, housing discrimination, for instance, remains, and other forms of discrimination. And we will see in this presentation that, for instance, the impact of the last administration was negative, and how quickly we can revolve back to situations that actually are present with challenges for community members, and a certain lack of safety also because of what is being shared in the media, for instance, and on social networks. So the acceptance of the community, I think, undeniably has grown through the years. The civil rights were important. We talked about marriage for all. Advocacy has advanced the cause, but it's important also to think that the community, as we could tell from the last few campaigns, can be used politically, whether people decide to support it or whether people decide that they should not support it because maybe it's going to cost them some votes. And so the community is often in the middle of this, just like other smaller groups in our society. The impact of the last administration we have to face was negative. Sometimes there were comments right out of the White House and the president's office on transgender folks, for instance. And so here we were, and I think that under this administration, and this is not a political statement, but it's based on clear observations, it's obvious that things are getting better. So some forms of housing discrimination remain. We're going to talk about that for our veterans. And then particularly within the community, I think it's fair to say that transgender people experience more of the housing challenges, and there'll be a slide dedicated to that. And I just want to say that I am thankful for the fact that SSVF really has a welcoming and affirming stand on LGBTQ matters. I wanted to say that because it's just really nice to see. And also because some of the issues I'm going to talk about are not about SSVF, of course, although we are an SSVF provider. Next slide, please. So for many years, the community experienced oppression. Oppression caused isolation. People would not talk about being gay or lesbian. They would live often in secrecy. There was homophobia in the DoD culture. That is pretty obvious when you read up on it, when you talk to older veterans. There is still, probably it's safe to say, among some members in active duty, some homophobia, of course. There was a sense of shaming and threats to expose LGBTQ community members, which was not just at the DoD, but elsewhere in society. And if you were exposed, there would be significant effects on your life and your career. In fact, your career could be destroyed, and your life as well, in terms of your reputation, of course. In those days, some of the religious beliefs, of course, were also impacting things negatively. And now a number of religious congregations actually perform LGBTQ marriages and weddings. So things have evolved tremendously. This feeling of secrecy also was in the family unit, and I think it's fair to say that for some people it's still there, of course. For instance, when you think of bisexual men and whether they're open with their families or not, and that's just their choice, and everybody makes a choice. So yeah, absolutely. But the family secret, of course, is the thing everybody seems to know about or knows about, and nobody talks about it. So let's look at this from a sociological point of view. You know, when you look at a larger group, which is, of course, the heterosexual group, the straight group, and then this smaller group of the community, you have uneven relations when a group is much larger than another group. And of course, our mores in the society tend to be heteronormative. So the norms are based on recognized or accepted heterosexual behavior more of the time because we're a smaller community. So you have to think of that when you work with your vets and see, of course, how open they are. How do they carry some sense of homophobia themselves toward themselves? What their history has been, their experience in the system. Have they experienced trauma during their active duty based on assault or based on social rejection, or the fact that they could not be open even sometimes to their medical providers? Again, this smaller group versus the larger group kind of setting the norms. Next slide, please. So, there was a legal structure of oppression. I'm not sure what happened to the font there, but we'll fix that. So the oppression was really reflected in the legal system. People could be arrested in a gay or lesbian club. In a gay club, you couldn't stand at the bar. You had to sit at a table and a waitress would bring you drinks because it was deemed inappropriate to have, two men stand next to one another. Public shaming in the newspapers after these arrests at nighttime in the clubs. People's names would be published in the newspapers. Some discrimination in the federal system. In the federal system at large, not just at DOD, people could be outed and fired, and that included the State Department. So people lived in fear of being found out and having their careers ended. Discrimination and social rejection in the DoD system was especially obvious in firings, of course, in discharges, less than honorable discharges, and, for instance, lack of upward mobility, because if it was known that somebody was gay, they may not be able to access a promotion. Don't ask, don't tell, which seemed so benign in 1994 when it was put in place, ended up being a problem in itself, of course, with the impact on veterans through the discharge status, still obvious nowadays. And then, of course, during the last administration, banning transgender candidates from entering the armed forces, and as you know, this has been undone, and now by the new administration. At a time when actually LGBTQ homosexuality was listed in the DSM. So the DSM, for those of you who don't know, is the manual of all the psychiatric diagnoses, and we were listed as one of them, which seems incredible nowadays. Could also impact very severely on family members who could be admitted by a family member because that person decided that because the person was seen as, we would say in the day, homosexual, they could actually be admitted into a psych unit. And so very problematic issue, and obviously no longer the case, but it's part of our history. Next slide, please. So oppression, victimization, and housing, which is our topic today. The climate of oppression has, in my eyes, created more victimization. There are hate crimes against LGBTQ community members. The murder of Matthew Shepard is an example of that. But of course, also on the street, for instance, the victimization of transgender women of color. And homophobia is exacerbated in the political climate in some groups nowadays. It's fair to say. There is fear mongering, there is scapegoating, and again, use at key political times of the community to sort of for political gains. And the white nationalist movement, for instance, is anti-LGBTQ and a number of other things, and a number of the evangelist groups the same. So this fear mongering, for instance, what's going on in Florida right now, where you can't say gay in some of the classrooms, as if somehow discussing that or even having a gay or lesbian teacher was going to make it so that more people turn out to be gay. That is absurd, but it is a part of our society in some areas of it. So some communities, and this is important to know for those of you who cover larger areas, some communities express more openly homophobic views than others, and your LGBTQ vets may or may not know that if they're not familiar with the community, but also, may choose not to live around these communities. Some areas are considered much less safe than others to live in for the same reasons. So LGBTQ service member can experience additional challenges during active service, which are going to have an impact emotionally and economically, we're going to see, on their situation pre and post discharge, where we are in SSVF. And this can impact housing navigation and stability. So for those of you who don't know, in homeless services, we work in 2 phases. Housing navigation is where we're helping the person get placed into a living situation. And stability is when we help the person continue to live there in a stable way. So both phases, in my eyes, are impacted by situations that you can trace back to the active duty period. Next slide, please. So housing challenges for veterans in 2022. The first thing that came up when I spoke to the team was the fact that, again, some transgender veterans face assaults and unsafe situations in emergency and transitional shelters. And this happens in our area, which is a pretty progressive area. These incidents create physical and emotional stress for veterans and traumatic events with later effects. And of course, at Friendship Place, we use trauma-informed care. We recognize the impact of trauma in people's lives. It also creates challenges for staff, in my eyes, who have to sort of witness and contend with situations they know may be less than safe or potentially unsafe, at least for the folks they are working with, even on a temporary or transitional basis. And so it makes it more difficult, of course, to establish a trust relationship when you in the back of your mind, you're wondering what's going to happen in that particular shelter. The issues are not consistently addressed by service providers. Some sort of look the other way, and it's often it takes a while to get training going, and effective training in particular. And then, of course, at the system level, even here in DC, I think we sometimes have challenges addressing LGBTQ issues and an advocate for them, obviously. It's really interesting to me that when it comes to LGBTQ, somehow something sometimes get lost, and they should not. Other members of the LGBTQ community, not just transgender folks, can experience homophobia in the shelter. And for transgender folks, employment also is a big issue, as most of you probably know. The employment rate the challenges are twice the ones faced by other folks, and then often disconnection from family, over around 57% in one of the sites I saw for disconnection from families. So those natural resources that can be really helpful to our veterans are missing at 57% for this group. And here I'd like to share a story that just came in yesterday as I was preparing. And this is a story from one of our transgender vets, somebody we serve, a transgender woman, who had taken a room in a larger place with 4 other veterans. And things seemed to go fine at first, but eventually one day she got home and one of the roommates was talking about her on the porch and being very verbal, very aggressive and threatening in conversation with somebody else. She decided that she had to move out, because she no longer felt safe. So in a roommate setting, you can also see things go down in terms of what happens and the dynamics based on the fact that some people are going to be more aware of some things as weeks and months go by, and it's really important to keep an eye on that. Next slide, please. So homophobia among landlords was the next topic when I talked to the team. And it's, you know, I underline there that it can be hard to detect, but important to read. It's hard to detect because most landlords are not going to tell you that they are prejudiced against members of the LGBTQ community, particularly around veterans, right? People who have served our country, but it is there, and it's important to read. And for most of us who have at one point, of course, approached a landlord to rent an apartment, who are members of the community, there were things that we know to look for. You can tell almost right away if somebody is going to be prejudiced or is uncomfortable with the fact that you're arriving to rent an apartment with your partner, and it's obvious that you're a couple, right? So some landlords have homophobic attitudes, and again, not readily expressed. Some excuses we get for not renting is the credit score or low income, but they would not necessarily come up with folks who are perceived as heterosexual or straight, right? And they come up in cases like this. As a result, some veterans introduce their partners or as friends or family members, but they don't acknowledge the relationship. And there's an issue with that in a setting that needs to be welcoming and affirming. It's less than affirming, I'm sure you will agree, to have to sort of misrepresent your relationship in this apartment that's going to become your home. I find that really problematic, but a lot of people resort to that. Staff also, I think, are involved. And for staff, it's really, we're all about social justice, racial justice, LGBTQ inclusion. And to have to witness and contend with this sort of negative and unfair housing practice is I think, also problematic. So this situation can present with any new landlord. You have to, there are some code words that you get on the phone sometimes. I've gotten them actually myself during a search. This area is for families. And, the landlord asked me, well, so, who's your household? I said, well, my partner and I, yeah. And then you get, well, this area is for families. That's code for, don't try to rent here. It seems unbelievable, but it happens. And the issue may arise after the move, so you got to keep an eye on that. Although in this service delivery, things go rapidly toward discharge, of course. But the result is that some households live in fear that it could happen. Next slide, please. So I'm seeing time go by, and I want to be mindful that the other presenter needs plenty of time. We gathered some statistics for you that you can read in detail that all point to the fact that stemming from the active duty period into the veteran period, post-discharge, there are links that you can establish based on maybe less integration and relationships that were not as productive for the veteran in terms of their income and their ability to grow the income, their ability to seek healthcare, because some veterans are not open, some active duty members are not open with their doctors about their being members of the LGBTQ community. The effect of discharges due to don't ask, don't tell. So what the situation we have is that economically, LGBTQ household on the whole are in a more difficult situation than other households in the system. And this came from the Center for American Progress, down to the fact that some have a hard time purchasing food. Next slide, please. So also in healthcare, we talked about that, mental health care, which can be, of course, very important, connection to healthcare, And again, these disparities show a lower level of system integration in my eyes during active duty, which cause situations that are problematic, both in terms of access to healthcare and economically when people come out. Next slide, please. So what can you do? Well, you know, and one recommendation that's not here that came from the transgender woman we served is she immediately, when she felt that she had to move quickly, looked for gay-friendly housing sites. And so you can use with your vets gay-friendly housing sites where it's more likely that the households are going to be LGBTQ and LGBTQ and allies, of course. So make sure your organization's culture is welcoming and affirming beyond the colors, right? The colors are wonderful. We have them at Friendship Place, but it takes more than that. An LGBTQ work group, your leadership being in tune to LGBTQ inclusion. Check your own level of comfort. It can be grown, and that's a good thing if you need to grow your level of comfort. But be prepared for these conversations, because if you're not, the person is going to pick up on that and is going to sense some, at least a lack of comfort, and may project that into some kind of bias in their mind. Become familiar with LGBTQ cultures, plural, right? There are different cultures and their histories. Use an empathic, transparent, and non-judgmental approach. Be aware of generational differences. Some of the history I went over with you obviously points to the fact that our older vets view things in a very different way because of what they've experienced in the past when society was not as open. Call out microaggressions, homophobic remarks and attitudes, and that's it's important not to tolerate this kind of discourse, the name calling and the other pieces. It needs to be called out. And then link, of course, to LGBTQ plus groups that can provide you with support and educational opportunities. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brian Ellicott. I'm the program manager of Sage Vets, and I wanted to talk today about one of our housing programs that has actually been fairly successful in housing LGBT seniors. And that's primarily as well as LGBT veterans. So Sage is the country's largest LGBTQ. We were founded in 1978. And our headquarters is here in New York City. New York City, Sage is the national organization that offers supportive services and consumer resources for LGBT older people and their caregivers. Sage Veterans is specifically a statewide program here in New York that helps LGBTQ people over the age of 50 who are veterans of military service improve their access to the VA and other services, as well as support their overall health and wellness. Next slide, please. So here at Sage Vets, we do outreach and education throughout New York State. We have case management where we assist with the VA benefit system, legal advice and counseling. In New York, we have restoration of honor for those who were discharged under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. They can have their dishonorable discharge upgraded as a result of that hard work. We do know your rights trainings, and every week we hold a support group for our LGBTQ veterans. So restoring equal rights to LGBTQ veterans. July 1st, June 1st is when we first had to for those discharged under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And those things resulted under sexual orientation, gender identity, military sexual assault, PTSD, and traumatic brain injury. Next slide, please. So I wanted to speak about our housing program, which is part of Stonewall. We have a place called Stonewall House. In 2014, we learned through our participant base that 48% of same-sex older adult couples had faced some form of housing discrimination. And we launched our national LGBTQ elder housing initiative and made a decision to catalyze affirming LGBT housing in New York City. In 2014, we put in our RFP with the New York City Housing Authority, known as NYCHA, requesting bids to redevelop a existing public housing unit in Fort Greene. We worked with a developer, BFC, and engaged and submitted a bid to redevelop an older NYCHA building and to give it an upgrade and a facelift to make it more appealing to older adults, specifically within the LGBT community. As we call it, Stonewall House opened in 2019. We have 145 units dedicated, one of the first of 2 LGBT low-income affordable housing units in New York City. LGBT culturally competent case management and supportive services are available in the building, and we utilize 9% of low-income housing tax credit in that development. Of those units, 145 of them are through those who have been affected by homelessness and housing insecurities in the past. Next slide, please. So things to consider when you want to create housing like this through some of the federal and state programs is community need, deep affordability, physical infrastructure, social, mental, emotional, and cognitive health needs. So for many of deep traumatic experiences around homelessness, housing insecurity, discrimination around their sexual orientation or gender identity, their lack of access to things like a pension and a savings that will keep them comfortable for long periods of time. And also as people age and they need access to things like railings and banisters in their homes that make their lives more accessible and continue to allow for their lives to grow and change. So how did Sage do this without violating fair housing laws? We were very clear on our language and development of LGBT-friendly or welcoming marketing materials for eligible residents to provide clear communication in the application process. Stonewall House presented its own specific marketing process required for multiple agencies such as HPD and NYCHA. We could build housing that is affirming, friendly, and welcoming to LGBTQ people, but as well as our allies. We hosted community forums and engagement sessions explaining the project to the community, as well as making sure that our ads were in all languages, different color schemes, showed the building fully built, and we engaged with the lives and met the people who are our SAGE members who wanted to live in those communities. In order to do those things, you have to go to the community and talk to them so you get their buy-in about who will be coming and living in those spaces. Next slide, please. So the real challenges and lessons were being able to reach out to the people who we knew needed to apply for these buildings, which are our LGBT elders, making sure they have access to those websites and applications through HUD and NYCHA so that they could fill out and apply for those apartments, any financing gaps or any documentation gaps. And again, making sure we have that community buy-in and historically recognizing the displacement of LGBTQ people in some of those neighborhoods. That's all I have.
Thank you, Brian and Jean-Michel, for joining us today. We have a couple of questions for you panelists before we get off of the webinar. But again, thank you so much for being here and sharing your expertise with our client, our members, and our other service providers who are on the call. So one of the first questions we have, Jean-Michel, I think, and Brian, I think we went through a lot of information there. I would say, what do you guys, I think, Brian, what do you think have you found as one of the most challenging things about like housing placement within the community right now, as far as the obstacles that you face? And you guys spoke a little bit about it, but could you expound on that, the obstacles that you guys face?
I think the biggest obstacle that at least that I've seen is recognizing that there is just not one neighborhood.
Brian, you are cutting out a
That
bit.
LGBT people want to live in, that they, we live in all neighborhoods across, at least here I live in one.
Oh, you were cutting out a bit, Brian. Could you repeat your answer again? I'm sorry.
It's we're not just wanting people to live in one place, that we are living across all portions of our city, and that when we pick locations, there isn't just one specific location that our community wants.
Okay, thank you. Jean-Michel, anything from you about that?
Well, I would say the same, and then to really educate the community so people avoid generalizations, avoid a perception of the community as sort of monolithic or one way or one other. And we're doing a lot of work in that area in Friendship Place, and helping people also avoid sort of a focus on the community that just picks up on the more salient things. For instance, drag in the gay community. Sometimes some presenters, and even academics will really emphasize that, but it's just one feature. I'm fine with it. It's part of the community, but it's just one feature. And sometimes it seems that it becomes very salient, and maybe because there's now a generational difference between some of us older members and some of the newer members who really haven't experienced club life and other forms of life. But I encourage people to really be careful what they pick up on in these presentations. Uh, and the fact of always talk about the fact that there are LGBTQ plus cultures, plural, right? But there is a feeling for me certainly to be part of a community that gives us strength at the same time, which is very good.
Thank you for your answers. Another question: how can SSVF providers better serve LGBTQ plus veterans? The barrier of placing veterans in a hotel or emergency housing is not an option in most cases. How can we advocate for that in our current programming? Thank you, Fallon Williams, for that question.
Yes. Well, with this kind of situation, I would recommend to be particularly careful around transgender folks you work with, because the placements are sometimes more challenging for them. We know that employment is more challenging, so stability is going to be impacted after the subsidy period. Um, I think to educate, I think nonprofits like Friendship Place have a responsibility to educate the community. And you can start by just creating an LGBTQ plus work group, giving some training sessions, having these conversations at staff meetings, having conversations like that with your board and your leadership, so that everybody understands that this is an important part of the service delivery, and people have got to get comfortable with it. And then to help vets who have been traumatized during their active period, to sort of undo what is going on in their mind sometimes, and maybe help people toward a greater sense of acceptance, of personal acceptance, which is a lot to do in a period that is actually not very long.
Another question we have. Let me see. We have a bunch of questions coming in. So we'll find a good one for you guys. This one is a bit topical. Have you seen an increase in negative response due to the negative media of monkeypox? And if so, how would you challenge this?
So, Brian, do you want to take that first, or?
At Sage, we've been doing outreach through another program we have called Sage Positive, which works with HIV positive and AIDS affected communities who have been doing the outreach for monkeypox directly, and making sure we just spread the information on the vaccine to.
Oh, okay, thank you so much, Brian. Yeah, I think you cut out a little bit, but I think most of what you said was you guys have been very active in spreading information about the vaccine and making sure that your clients know about that as a possibility and that it's an option for them. So thank you for that answer. Question for either one of you guys, probably. I'm not sure if how do you guys how do you help to get a discharge changed if it was LGBTQ related?
So here in New York, we have restoration of honor as a state law. It's not a federal law. There has to be a federal law put in place for all 50 states to have access to restoration of honor. But if they are a New York State resident, my contact information is up on the slides. So right now it's only a state restoration of honor, which gets us some of that, life back to our participants, but unfortunately it's not a federal law yet.
Okay, thank you for that information. And to the attendees, we will be sending out the slides and the video from today's webinar, so you'll be able to see, get the slides that our presenters have shown, and you'll be able to get their contact information and be able to reach out to them if you have any other questions for them afterwards. Another question for either John, Michelle, or Brian. Have you seen a reluctance within the population to identify as a veteran or connect to veteran services given past experiences where they had to maybe conceal their identities in the military?
Well, yes, we're seeing some folks who just, have a sense of maybe a form of bias toward their own sexual orientation, their own identity that is just drawn from their experiences, and not just that the experience during active duty, but experience maybe in the family they grew up in the neighborhood they grew up in. Um, and I think that's common to other members of the LGBTQ community, not just veterans. That some people really have a lot of undoing to do, and some of us maybe have less, um, but it is there for a lot of people. Yeah.
I would say we're seeing both, people identifying either more predominantly as a veteran than a member of the LGBT community or vice versa because of some of their trauma. And at least in the support group I run, we try to expand that so that people understand that you can have that intersectionality and better moving forward.
Another question, and Brian, your audio is cutting out a little bit. It's going in and out, so I'll let you know about that when it happens again. Question for either one of you: how should outreach for unhoused LGBTQ plus veterans look specifically? Do you have any recommendations? Thank you for that question. I think JC Davis, thank you for that question.
Well, I think you have to have well-trained staff who are comfortable with members of the LGBTQ community and who can, connect on a very natural level with people. That's essential. Because, as I said earlier, when people feel that somebody is not comfortable, um, it triggers some thoughts. And these thoughts can go all the way to the fact that this person may be prejudiced. That's why they're not comfortable. That's why they seem uneasy around me. So I think people have to do the work first, and organizations are responsible for that, to train up in that area. People can grow their level of comfort and should. Um, and again, I think that's an organizational responsibility.
Another question I have, for either one of you, do you see the whole health model being integrated and utilized in VA housing programs to promote longevity / success in veterans housing goals? This is from Elizabeth Jarman. Thank you for the question, Elizabeth.
Brian, if you know about this, I'm happy to let you do it. I'm not sure, but you're muted.
Oh, you're muted, Brian.
I'm trying to make sure that my. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good now. Go ahead.
Okay. Can you repeat the question?
I got you. Do you see the whole health model being integrated and utilized in VA housing programs to promote longevity / success in a veterans housing goals?
So I would say that for the
We lost you again, Brian.
participants that are veterans that we work with, the VA has connection between LGBT people and their housing goal model, because they don't, oftentimes what we hear is they don't take into account a person's whole self. The VA only sort of sees them as veterans and doesn't understand the intersectionalities and the uniquenesses of, let's say, our trans veterans and our LGBT veterans, those unique situations that they face as LGBT people as well as veterans.
And that can happen in other areas of the medical care, which this is interesting, how some providers are really in tune, and others don't seem to even factor that in as a possibility. The fact that the person across the desk from them in their office may be a member of the LGBT community, that's always been interesting to me.
Well, we had all our questions answered from our audience, and I thank my wonderful panelists for the great work they do every day and for being here on our webinar to share with our members and others who have logged in.
David,
Everybody,
I found one question that just came in.
one more? Okay.
It was around how would you help a LGBTQ veteran get their discharge status changed if in fact they're other than honorable or they're dishonorable or whatever whatever that status might be was related to the fact that they were LGBTQ.
Oh, I did answer that.
Okay.
Yeah, we went through that one earlier. I think Brian mentioned that New York.
That there are challenges with that in that.
And I mentioned that.
Go ahead, Brian. I'll go well.
Yeah, in New York State, we have restoration of honor, which allows those discharges to be fixed. It's not a federal law. That's the issue, is that federally we need to fight for federal restoration of honor. And certain states, California, New York, Connecticut, there's a couple others that have state restoration of honor, which allows for that to happen.
And one of the difficulties in this is finding people who can actually confirm that this happened, right? Be witnesses to that because of the way the system works, and so that makes things more difficult for people.
Well, we're gonna wrap up now. Thank you guys again. To our attendees, you'll be getting the recording of this and the slides and the contact information for our great panelists. Our next webinar will be in December, and you'll get information about that very shortly. Hope everybody has a great rest of their day, and thank you again. Bye.
Thank you, David. Great to work with you. Thanks for the invite.
No problem.